that would imply that goods acquired under Ottoman control of Greece ought to be given back, or at least offered back to the Greeks. And since this is about an issue of individual members and their primary, on a liberal tradition, their primary good, living a good life, their most basic right, if my argument works, it trumps any issues, any interests we might have in scientific matters, in just purely knowledge things. So I'm saying that in these circumstances, we need to give these goods back to the minority groups, even if what they plan to do with it is destroy it. Because they have a greater right, the individual members of these groups have a greater right in being able to live a good life than we do in the advancement of science. And that is weird, I'll be honest, that is weird for a philosopher to say, because one of the things I am most concerned about is figuring out what I have best reason to believe is true, and I think science is a great way to do that. I value science immensely. I do not mean to denigrate scientific endeavors here. Ideally, from a personal perspective, I would find it ideal if people that owned, or at least had control of these material goods, found the groups that they belonged to, offered them back. The group said, okay, make a copy, give us the originals, study the copy, and then we'll do whatever the hell we want with the originals. That would be great, because then we could still learn from the stuff, and they could still do things like bury grave goods, or destroy things that they think should no longer exist. That's ideal, because I find our interest in knowledge and the scientific endeavor to be very important. But I do think it's trumped by individuals' rights to live a good life. And I think that gets these issues of control of cultural property can stand in the way of people's ability to live a good life, particularly members of minority groups that do not meet these requirements of minimal sovereignty that I was talking about. If you can give me a way to make that move I was just talking about, I would love it. If you could tell me how I can make a claim that a group that has minimal sovereignty, the individuals of that group can still claim the right to property acquired by others when their group did not have minimal sovereignty, that would be a huge help in my own personal research. Otherwise, I think I've made an interesting argument. I think it's important. I think it does, weirdly, for a philosophical argument, have implications for a current debate in archaeology and museum studies and that kind of stuff. But it would have a huge, if I could make a good case, because essentially what I'm saying is things like the Elgin marbles, if I can make that move, I'd be able to make the argument that the Elgin marbles ought to be given back to Greece. I'd be able to argue that Egyptian goods held in Paris ought to be given back to the Egyptians. The implications of that argument would essentially be a totally reorganization of the way we think of museums and archaeology in general, which, of course, archaeologists and museums may or may not like, right? And how it would play out, because I think a lot of them would say, no, you can keep it, because it's important that people learn about us, and you keeping it might be a good way to do that. I hope a lot of them would do that, or at least, but I think their ability to control it is more important. And if they want to destroy it, I'd be sad, but that, I think, would be what we'd have to swallow. That's mostly my spiel. Last slide is the thank you slide. So thanks for inviting me. Thanks to the Philosophy Club, and in particular Tom Pine, who I've talked about, and he's been some help, and a friend of mine who is getting a PhD in Native American Studies over at Davis, James Sarmento, and of course my lovely wife who puts up with me doing all this shit all the time. Yes, sir.
No, thank you very much.
You're welcome, man. It was a little more scattered than it would have been had I remembered that little 4-inch long wire. So I apologize. I actually thought about it this afternoon to stick it in my bag. I stuck my computer in my bag, and I forgot the dongle. So this would have been a little more coherent had I been able to do these. So thank you for putting up with that. Any questions? Or I made my schedule open till 5, even though I knew I wouldn't talk that long. So I actually talked about 10 or 15 minutes longer than I would have had I had my slides here. So yeah, I don't know how this normally goes. We can chat for an hour.
Usually open up the discussion after the lecture.
Right.
People feel fine.
My students, you can stay or go. I mean, hopefully you want to stay and talk about it, but
Yeah,
I'm not going to fail you much
I got all that.
if you ignore it. Mr. Miller.
I think like a scenario, probably like how you're talking about with Napoleon coming into Egypt and looting everything.
Mm-hmm.
Not talking about that, but if a museum in France or something legally bought, say like a tomb of some sort or a casket or something
Mm-hmm.
from the Egyptian people 100 years ago, legally bought it from them, do you think that it is their responsibility to give it back to them, even though they were the ones that sold it to them in the first place?
It would depend on the conditions in Egypt when the Egyptians sold. Right?
Assuming they weren't forced to or coerced to in any way, or like even with any culture, Native Americans, if their people had bow or something, I don't know, something, and sold it to someone 100 years ago.
Oh, it's an interesting kind of thing because again, the Egyptians had a state 100 years ago, and so if it was legal, there would presumably be state rules and state laws that the sale had to go by and stuff. And so I think that would probably be a perfectly fine way of acquiring things because essentially it would be that cultural group saying, here, you can have this stuff for a particular payment. I think that I'm not saying that part of the control of the minimal sovereignty, I think, is the ability to sell it or give it to somebody. Right? I mean, that's partly control too. So Egypt having a state, if stuff was purchased when the people they were getting it from had minimal sovereignty, I think that's perfectly fine.
What if they did?
If they didn't have minimal sovereignty, then it's a much more complex issue because the pressure, right? If they're particularly poor, and now here I don't know enough about the particular conditions. 100 years ago, Egypt had a state, so we'd have to go farther back. But if we're talking about like Native American groups, if I find a particular a group of, if it's 100 years ago, it's let's make it 150 years ago, right? It's 1870, and I'm traveling around the West. I mean, this is the middle of the Indian Wars, and I find some folks who are hard put. They're having a hard time making ends meet, finding food and stuff, and I offer them a bunch of money or a bunch of food for some particular artifact that I think is interesting. They're going to be hard pressed to resist, right? And that particular artifact that they might have been in possession of might have been something of great importance to the culture at large. And so they probably shouldn't have sold it. Well, they didn't have the right to sell it given that central importance without sort of consulting with the other members of the group. Now, given the hard circumstances we're assuming, it was justifiable that they sell it anyway. Right? I mean, if I've got your stuff and I'm starving to death, and somebody offers me $1 million, offers me a few meals for it, I'm going to sell your stuff. Even though it's not really mine to sell. Just because, look, under that hard of circumstances, you're justified to do a lot of stuff that technically, maybe in other circumstances, you shouldn't. So I think if that's more like what we're talking about, then I think whoever owns the bow, you mentioned a bow, right? Whoever owns that thing now, whether they were the one, they're not going to be the one who bought it in 1870. That person's dead. They're probably somebody's offspring or an institution. I think that they should find the group and the representative, the legitimate representatives of the group, not just an individual, but legitimate representatives of the group of origin, and say, hey, look, I've got this thing. It came from your culture. It was acquired under these circumstances. I obviously didn't do anything to take it, but it's now in my possession, or it's in my institution's possession. Can we keep it? We'd like your permission to keep it. Or do you want this back? Can we trade you something if you do want it back? We'd like something that represents whatever it is that this, whatever reason this thing is significant, why we want to keep it in our institution. We'd like to still be able to maintain that. I think they should try to work something out, because like I said, ideally, the knowledge gets shared with everybody, and the people have control. But some groups find certain kinds of knowledge as sacred, as only insiders, only initiated people should know these things about their culture. And it being out there for everybody to know is, in some sense, sacrilege. I think those things should never have left those communities in the first place.
Well, with the example of Napoleon, how are the museums justifying them keeping it, the museums keeping it, if Napoleon basically stole everything?
Yeah.
Raided pillaged the villages.
They're doing a variety of things. One argument has been the care argument. That's been the longest standing one, was that museums in Germany and France and England and the U.S. in particular, those four places in particular, but Italy to some extent and some other things, but mostly in the four countries I just mentioned, had state-of-the-art facilities to take care of this stuff better. And they were afraid if they returned it to the country of origin that they would fall apart, they'd be abused, they'd decay, they'd be worthless. And they certainly wouldn't be able to be studied by scholars. That's no longer the case in most of these things, particularly for places like Egypt and Greece. They have a pretty strong tradition now of preserving and presenting, making available artifacts of great cultural significance. Some other countries you might have some problems. Baghdad, I don't think it was anything particularly cultural, but just how particularly horrendous the situation was right when they started looting those museums and stuff. I don't know enough about the culture. I doubt that it was anything cultural about our past, whatever, because from my understanding, they are proud of their cultural heritage. But it was probably just a matter of, hey, people are stripping out the wires of buildings to sell for food and stuff. Maybe we can make some money for these, what were those called? The stamps, the roll stamps, right, where they'd make Baghdad had a huge collection of these things. They're little carved stones that you'd stick in hot wax and then roll across, and it would make a big picture.
Yeah, like whale tusks.
That would be more common in other cultures, but these were usually stone. But yeah, same kind of thing. Where was I going? I think most of these cultures now would be happy to kind of make this compromise. But again, like I said, I think the right that individuals have to be able to make legitimate choices that they see as, as valuable as choices of people in a different community. That requires their community, their cultural group, to essentially be in charge of their culture's stuff.
Regarding the argument about finding evidence for, say, for the Ottoman Empire at the time it ruled what is now Greece, could you argue something like if you could make the argument that the property taken at the time at which it wasn't a sovereign state, although now it is, if it was substantial enough that it contracted or lessened their cultural identity, their unity, their traditions, their practices, to such an extent that it affected their future ability to become a sovereign state, and that would be grounds for returning artifacts. That it affected them to such an extent that they would be different than they are today as a city.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to think about that. I mean, because I think that's probably true, right? That if
If you pillaged enough.
we had returned a lot, if a lot of that stuff had been returned right away, or just had never been pillaged, Greek identity might be different than it is now. So I think that's probably true. Whether or not we can base a rights claim on it, I'm less sure about. Particularly again, since we'd be hard pressed to say, we can. I think you're right that we could say modern Greeks would have a slightly different, maybe even a very different cultural identity had they been able to maintain control over these things. I think that's true, but that they are somehow harmed in their ability to see their choices as Greek choices, as valuable as other people's choices, that might be harder to make. What's occurred to me is maybe shifting the analogy from individuals in a state to states in an international community. That maybe we can argue, and this is not. I'd have to move away a little bit from the liberal tradition here. But it occurs to me that there's an analogy that I might make that says that, look, by Greece the country, the